From Bowling Green State University and the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society, this is BG Ideas.
I'm going to show you this with a wonderful experiment.
Welcome to the BG Ideas podcast, a collaboration between the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society and the School of Media and Communication at Bowling Green State University. I'm Jolie Sheffer, an associate professor of English and American Culture Studies and the director of ICS. This is the second episode of a three-part series on Homelands and Histories, in which we talk to people making big impacts on local communities through their work on land use and cultural heritage. The word homeland evokes for some people comforting feelings of patriotism or shared cultural identity, but it has also been used to justify expulsion or even genocide. For this series, we deliberately use the plural word histories in order to call attention to the many points of conflict, debate, erasure, violence, and silencing that accompany efforts to describe and interpret the past. Today we're joined by Dr. Elizabeth Beth Castle, a scholar, community organizer, and documentary filmmaker. She is from Mansfield, Ohio, and is currently teaching at Denison University. Dr. Castle is completing her film Warrior Women, which traces the history of women's activism in the Red Power and American Indian movements, beginning in the 1970s up to the recent and widely publicized protests against construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. Dr. Castle has been researching and recording oral histories of Standing Rock community activists for almost 20 years. Her work has led to meaningful collaboration with Madonna Thunderhawk, a Lakota community organizer and co-founder of Women of All Red Nations. Dr. Castle's goal in this and other work is to facilitate a reciprocal flow of knowledge and resources intended to empower, liberate, and maintain Indigenous communities. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Beth Castle to BGSU as part of ICS's 2018 Spring Speaker Series. Thanks for being here, Beth.
Thank you.
One of the things that we are interested in discussing is the relationship between different kinds of knowledge and different modes of activism, such as scholarship, art, grassroots organizing. Can you begin by telling us a little bit about your particular path to becoming both a scholar and a filmmaker? Did these start at the same time, or did one lead to another?
I would say that my path has been absolutely one that I have made up as I go along, and I'm still making it up, and I'm still trying to determine where I'm most effective and have a hard time maybe taking on particular descriptions of the things that I do. Working as a scholar, that's something that happened because I wanted to pursue the story and the stories of activists who changed the world for us in the 60s and 70s. And in the process of pursuing that story and wanting to know it, thinking about how I was going to be sort of a conduit or an arbitrator or one that could help then have other people learn from that story. I could amplify it. So it was that path that led me to be a scholar, in as much that I wanted to have people experience the feeling of seeing the ways in which their story can interrupt, intervene, and reshape that master historical narrative that they feel erased by and are erased by. Because our collective histories are typically erased by historical propaganda, information either that we don't know or information that we've been given to support a certain sense of the state. As a filmmaker, it's still a word that is hard for me to connect to. But once you start to make a film, you just have to own the fact that you are a filmmaker, which is something I'm working on doing. And, the film Warrior Women is a collaboration between a lot of folks, but specifically between me and the co-director of the film, Christina D. King, who is a native filmmaker from Oklahoma.
One of the things you've talked about is disrupting the master narratives, and sort of you've done that in your approach to scholarship. You do that in your approach to the film. Could you talk a bit about how you have thought about audience, particularly for the film, and what types of audiences are you hoping to reach with the film, and what do you want them to come away thinking or learning or understanding?
I started all this as an oral history project. And it sort of became a project because I started to interview people for a dissertation. And as I was doing it, I was sitting down with folks with questions or expectations of, well, how are you going to go take this and make it something that helps you? And with some anger, understandably. So it was very early on that I understood a sense of accountability to the folks who I was interviewing and working with. And we all have better hindsight than we do often decision-making in the moment. So at that time, I was just a dissertation student. I was young, and I was able to at least fight for that as I went along in terms of wanting people to understand that I have this legitimacy that comes from being associated with a fancy university, and I have certain access, but this was a collective process as much as I had it in my power to make it that way. So the Warrior Women Project, first off and early on for this first couple of years, was a collective Indigenous-run oral history project. And now the film is a little bit of a different articulation of that because it's specifically a film, but all of it feeds and flows together into an idea where we are trying to disrupt the dominant narrative, but keep our focus as an audience on the women who are in the film and the women who were originally interviewed. Do they recognize what they're seeing about themselves in what we're producing? But ultimately, the idea of folks who care about change, to me, are the idealized audience. And if folks who care about social change and justice and equality watch the film and are moved by it, that is the single most important audience for the film.
Could you talk about how, over the course of this long project, you've seen the technologies you use really change and develop from film to digital, the rise of social media? How have some of those changes maybe made it easier to take a stand, to make a difference, to communicate one's vision?
There are changes in technology that have potentially made things easier for folks. But one thing's consistent is that we have to spend more time letting young folks know y'all have it and y'all can do it. And I know that we're all telling you that there's so many lessons you need to learn first, but if there's one overwhelming lesson to pass on, is actually a quote from the film where Madonna Thunderhawk and her daughter Marcy Gilbert, are sitting in the audience waiting to run a session at the United Nations as part of an Indigenous gathering. And Marcy says to Madonna, she's like, well, you all didn't know what you were doing, but you did it anyway. And Madonna's like, that's right, we just did it anyway. And that's part of it, is just this emphasis of not sort of burdening you with all this idea of like, there's a certain way to do it. You don't have to sweat that so much, because you just have to stand up right now, whatever it is. And everybody's waiting for other folks to do it. Everybody, there's this tendency of like, and this feeling of helplessness. And, half the time, these folks who have this legacy of social change, how they started out was, it was just a couple of them that stood up in a room and said or did something, or a couple of them who put out. Now, for your version of that could also be you put something out that, went viral. You put something out there that changed everything. And I think that aspect of social media, that does make certain things easier, but like the core need for this current generation to like truly understand and feel their power. Because that's the analysis I would make, is that the very thing that might make certain things easier, this greater flow of knowledge and information through social media, can also make it seem like you're not as connected and you're maybe not getting your message out there. And, that's just something I feel is so strongly when I've talked to all these folks. We're like, we didn't have a plan, we just did it. And don't you freak out, about the fact that you're just, when young people are on the move, things change, period. And, you might be right on the precipice of something that, like right now, is the threat of gun violence enough to cross-cut the differences so that you have something that's somewhat similar to the way in which everybody came together to stop the war in Vietnam. Whatever motivates you the most is the thing to connect to and do it without apology.
I think that's something we've been thinking and talking about, is there may be a lot of things that concern you, but you only have to throw your energies into one. Do something rather than being paralyzed and not doing anything. the film kind of culminates with the Dakota Access Pipelines, right? And this being the most recent moment that's gotten a lot of attention. But your work goes back many, many years. And Madonna Thunderhawk and the other women you're talking about, this is organizing work that's decades in the making and that builds on another, more decades, centuries of activism. Could you talk about some of the longer arc that interest you in the stories you're following in the film and how your relationship has changed from when you first met them to now?
My relationship with Madonna and Marcy and other women in the community, it spans almost 20 years. When we talk about this idea of Homelands and Histories, that's the subject of the theme for the Institute this year. There's a way in which a sense of connection in a homeland that's not mine and the space where I'm actually from. So, I'm from Mansfield, Ohio, and my histories are from this area, but I'm connected with a group of people in this other geographic space. Their histories extend back through generations of activists and resistors, because for most folks to continue to live a cultural, political, and social life as a Native person is an act of resistance in and of itself. I may be the person who came in with scholarly questions, but my question was really, what's your story? And how do you want to share it? And I think that's what I've learned from Madonna is she appreciates working together because of the way in which I am willing to not be an academic robot. She supports my my need to work on making the experience of learning in school and who has control of knowledge, to blow that up and make it more accessible and make it something that's empowering. We just continue to do presentations and collaborations, and that normally we'd probably be talking together right now. So, often folks will say, well, are you being accountable? And should you, speak for and about this community? And the only thing I will really, say I can speak about is just, for example, the collaborative work that I've done with certain activists over time, where if I weren't representing and standing strong and saying that this flow of knowledge has to go back to folks and be meaningful to them, then I would be letting down my part in the responsibility of that relationship.
Well, that leads to another question, which is, it's so easy for, whether it's scholarship or traditional filmmaking, for there to be an imbalance of power where the person telling the story, right, is really the one in control. So can you talk about some of the sort of smaller decisions along the way or in the film itself that show how you've worked to center the experiences and perspectives of the women activists themselves rather than the audiences or even necessarily your own?
That comes into play almost every scene in the film. And one of the greater challenges, I'll just say, is, and this is something that folks probably feel similarly about communities they're connected to, is that there's so much unlearning and relearning that has to go on to start any conversation. And because we did such a crazy excellent job of practicing genocide and then pretending that we haven't in the United States, that there's all this unpacking that has to happen to understand the basic issues of anything tied to Indian country or Native issues. So boarding school is a good example where when we use the phrase boarding school, depending upon what you know, you might think of an elite academic opportunity, or you will think of a place of torture and cruelty where some of the greatest, most hypocritical and twisted stuff happened as part of government policy to eradicate Indian culture by forcing kids into Indian boarding schools. This is both Christina King and I thinking about this, where, well, what happens if we just don't even call them schools because we're tired of even like evoking it and then having to debunk it? Can we take that action, and what would that look like? How do we put it in? Do we get someone to say it? Because we can't say it, so someone has to narrate it in the film itself. So all of those things come into play. And then, to answer that, we never did end up reframing boarding schools as much as we wanted to. But then the question is, how much information do we put in there? Does it become a general primer, or can we just jump into the stories that are most relevant to Madonna and her sister Mabel Ann, and how basically we ended up with the idea that we wanted people to understand as much as we could convey what intergenerational trauma really looks like. It's not this abstract thing. It's not an excuse. It's imagine what it's like when you hear about how, your grandmother may have, literally never said to her daughter that she loved her or hugged her, or, and I'm not saying this is what happened in the case, but this is the sort of things that we wanted to convey that went beyond even the basic understandings. So yeah, those are great because it's just a tiny drop that has tons and tons of ripples, and that, probably just we spent months constructing and reconstructing that, and then still going, is that good enough?
I want to leave this open-ended, but, how has working with these women shaped how you've gone on to do scholarship and filmmaking? How have they influenced your process? That
actually gets back to the very notion of, of how something changes based on like a discipline or a profession, because we use the word audience as though there's something being performed for an audience that's taking it in. But to me, I think of audience as these women and their families taking in these stories as sort of told back to them, because one of the reasons why folks were initially willing to even sort of spend their time talking to me after they have experienced a lot of ways in which their stories are exploited was this idea that they were watching their grandkids turn to the television or turn to whatever, the screen was, and only pay attention to the screen. And so it was actually just a really brilliant move. So they're like, you're filming this, put the family story, put these stories and these cultural stories on camera so that my grandchildren will watch them and learn from them. So it was a really smart way to think about cultural intergenerational preservation of knowledge, which may not have been expressed in that lovely academic terminology, but was exactly what they were saying. It was the other thing that we usually experience as we're young, we don't pay attention to a lot of things that we then regret when we get older. And, as elders, they were thinking about future generations and thinking about ancestors. And those phrases get thrown around sometimes, but you can see how they're active motivating factors in people's life, even if they don't proclaim it in a sacred moment. They're motivated. And I realize, especially as I say, when I was younger, it was more just like social change at any cost. I'm going to run here. I'm going to flow there. I'm going to do whatever. And now it's a little more focused on future generations and those who came before us.
You talked about how the process with getting to know Madonna Thunderhawk began with asking, what's your story? And I think that it's important to underscore that simple thing is actually a really radically different way of approaching a subject, because we're trained to sort of come in, you've got your hypothesis, and now you have to go in and try and prove it. And instead, you open it up to truly a collaboration. And that, in this case, has lasted almost 20 years. Do you have any advice for students thinking about embarking on their own projects, about how to enter into that spirit of collaboration most productively?
It is hard to collaborate if you're trying to produce something and you're doing it because it's a requirement for a class and you have to please a professor. But if we look at it on the level of doing that type of scholarship as you move forward, maybe in graduate school, you can still do it in undergrad. But the challenge there is the belief in yourself and your ability to do it. We often frame, the classroom or the college experience where it's sort of like, I was about to use a hand gesture, but so I'm making a hand gesture where it's like a really high expectation level. And the expectations for you as students is maybe much lower than what the desired goal is. And you'd be lucky if you can get there. But just really believing in the fact that you have the tools. And if you don't, you're going to be able to figure it out. And in this case, it can be really, I guess it can be very daunting to go in and basically open something up to be like, what's your story? But realizing at the end of the day, if you're doing your job as an accountable academic or person, who wants to know more about this subject, you're going to shift anyway. It's going to reframe. It's just going to do the thing where it reframes your thesis question. And you're going to realize that at the end of the day, it just becomes richer for it. And so it sort of actually all works out in the end. It's just a struggle and a challenge along the way. It's always going to be way more interesting than being like, I have this thesis and I'm just going to try and squeeze all these data points into it. And all these data points happen to be people. You're going to go on a much more interesting ride if you realize that we all have a little potential for scholarship in us. Like we all have some thoughts about our own lives, and those are valid and should be part of the people's history or people's story.
Some questions from our students.
How do you think Indigenous issues can get the media coverage that they advocate for if their concerns are misrepresented?
I mean, the thing that has happened and is continuing to happen more since the Standing Rock resistance movement is there is more Indigenous media than there ever has been, and that is the great flow of digital communication and social media is that people can do podcasts pretty easily, and folks can do a live stream of an event and it just goes viral. So there's so many ways in which that level of mediation, which results in that misrepresentation that you're referring to, can be removed. And so, that is one of the most positive steps. And then the flip side are all the things that like we're doing right here and having conversations and raising awareness and, each one teach one and doing the unlearning. Because that's the thing in general is that I do think once we sort of point out a few things that are so normalized in our behavior about accepting the Cleveland baseball team's logo and mascot and things that we have to start pushing back and saying this is part of a colonial process. It erases people who are still here with us, whose children need to survive and thrive, sort of pushing back against that. But I think that, supporting the type of media that you are going to find probably based in social media as its home is getting more at the heart of what either Indigenous media makers or those who are accountable to Indigenous communities are doing.
How can those communities engage with institutions that they may be at odds with while asserting kind of their own concerns for that interaction?
That's like one of the oldest challenges that we have is like, are you going to try to change an institution whose almost whole goal is to eviscerate you, or make you invisible? Some of it is strategic. At the end of the day, a lot of the more Native folks we have coming into, like if we're looking at an academic institution and more people who are doing research that's accountable to Native people, that is already going to start to change that process. But overall, understanding that sort of like Indigenous issues are everywhere and Indigenous people are everywhere. And that's one of the things, again, that we don't typically know or see, because if we believe our K through 12 education and the general propaganda, people are going to think that Native people have been erased. And, at an institutional level, you need folks. It's not just Indigenous folks, but you need allies who are also going to advocate.
Thank you.
I have a question. Can you speak of the operational comparisons and contrasts between community organizers and nonprofit community organizations? Can you offer your thoughts on the way community organizers operate outside the capitalist neoliberal market structure?
So community organizing is like anything else. It's really tricky where at the moment, most of you are asking, how can I do social change and survive in a hyper-capitalist economy that is destroying all of us? Well, you can't all that much. You're going to have to commit to sort of trying to destroy what you can in the process because it has to change. Or this model right now that everybody's coming into college and trying to figure out how you're going to get a job is sort of not fair to you because unfortunately, all of us need to take some role and responsibility in figuring out how we're going to crack open some of these systems so that we can survive, so that we can have healthcare and all the things that we need to survive as a society. Now, the challenge with the nonprofit structuring is that it often takes like the move out of movement. It often ends up being that a lot of your efforts are going to go towards just trying to keep an organization functioning. So the idea that, or first thing that people would do is say, okay, well, we need to get a 501c3, or we need to figure out who our fiscal sponsor is. And that's one of the things I've learned from people I've worked with, where you may need to do that at certain points to have donation and certain money coming in, but don't spend your time there, because once you spend your time there, then, then the revolution will not be funded, right? And it will not go on because you are spending all your time sort of performing all these details of infrastructure that aren't helpful. But it's a real challenge where I think part of it is we have to, maybe think more collectively and more in line with forms of socialism, which I'm not saying are synonymous with Indigenous value systems, but they definitely share a common ideology of you share it. And so, we're trying to do like small bits of fundraising that provide gas money so that, organizers can get where they need to. Of course, these are organizers who would love to transform, the transportation system so they don't have to. But in the meantime, you have to meet people where you are and where they are. So, it's a very good question that you need to ask when you're going into a space about, where is this community? What do they need? And what do I need to survive?
So my question is, in keeping one foot in the community, one of the panelists, Dakota, begins to illustrate a key difference between the Indigenous folk who stick with land and tradition, and those who haven't. She says, quote, "So there are a lot of us who have had different experiences, and each experience is a very valid American Indian experience," end quote. She then goes on to say, in reference to those who had been married into other people or other cultures, quote, "They are the ones that are doing the blessing of everything representing us, and they know nothing about us. They know nothing about what is the true struggle of the people still on land, still with tradition," end quote. Do you find issue between this, gathering, separating of the Indigenous community, and as someone who exists outside of this tradition adoption dichotomy, but who's sort of framing this, how do you think it affects Indigenous activist practice and its ability to unite or divide?
So at the core of what you're describing, or what I'm hearing, is one of the greatest challenges of working in Indigenous issues and communities has a lot to do with how you maintain identity and who has the right to speak and who, and that's a very contested thing. So I would start by saying, I'm not the most appropriate person to answer that question. But with that parameter, I would say that that if we keep at least asking ourselves and qualifying and understanding the fact that we may not always be the right person to answer that question, that's part of what Dakota Hardin, the woman that you referenced, who is a longtime community organizer, activist, and facilitator, is referencing, is just the challenges of, as you are trying to revitalize, resurrect, and maintain a cultural identity that was and is the target of a cultural genocidal practice, that we need to erase it. Part of it is erasing the evidence of colonial settler, the colonial settler past of the United States, that this didn't happen. So in the process of trying to revitalize or reconnect, it can be difficult because then a lot of folks are asked for, you speak for your people. you're that voice. And, it's hard when somebody asks you to do that and you want to be like, well, I don't really know. I know I'm just trying to reconnect with this or that. So it is a major issue in Indian country. And I, want to be careful about saying things that aren't mine to say. And that's a crazy notion for sort of a mainstream framing where we think we're told often that we have the right to do everything and the right to say everything, and no one can tell us otherwise. But that's not what the motivations and the value systems are that drive Indigenous folks. So it needs to be an ongoing discussion, and it does just root down to this idea of still just being accountable to communities that you are speaking for / speaking about or representing. And, if I go through a day without using the phrase, I say accountable literally 20 times a day, and it never gets old because it's the thing that I think that at least keeps you in check, knowing that it still might go wrong, but at least you're in the practice of thinking about it.
In your own opinion, what things need to happen, or what can people do in order to have and maintain a more mutually beneficial and respectful relationship between those who are trying to learn and those who are trying to teach? How can this relationship become an even plane for learning, especially with advice for building relationships for activist work?
So the last part of that question, trying to learn and trying to, like, the mutually beneficial relationships between trying to learn and trying to teach.
Yes, like without having that, without establishing like a power dynamic, while like coming into these spaces trying to learn, but also trying to be the one that's like going to be the one that's divulging this information elsewhere.
I would connect to the feeling of humility and being humble. Also recognizing that that's difficult because there are times when you have to literally take the microphone and say and do and speak. But by and large, thinking about the collective we, and you'll find that, at least in my experience, when you do take the hierarchy out of it and you try to make it a shared experience, the folks who really do have the knowledge and the advice to share will have the space to share it, and you'll be able to listen and take it in. And hopefully it'll be done in a way that still recognizes the folks who do have experience to share. And I think that's just part of it, is just reframing. It's like, if somebody has the experience, you want that experience and you want them to have a chance to share it with you. And I just think about it with like a little bit of an Indigenous community model where, you give the space for elders to share, and they're going to take it. And that's what's going to happen. But, as young people, it's your obligation and responsibility to a certain degree to push back when necessary. And that's part of like what happens from generation to generation.
Thank you very much, Beth. Now I'll do our credits. Our producer today is Chris Cavera. Special thanks to our co-sponsors, the Ethnic Cultural Arts Program in the College of Arts and Sciences, the School of Earth, Environment, and Society, and the Departments of Communication, Media Production and Studies, and Theater and Film. Thank you very much.